Thank you, Gary. It's an honor to be here with all of you, and there are many of you that I know and know the kind of work that you do day in and day out on these issues. And when I say it's an honor, I truly mean it. Ambassador, thank you. Where'd the ambassador go? Thank you for your remarks and for your leadership and, as you say, spreading the gospel of climate change around the United States. It was an honor as well to be here with Governor Brown and to when I accepted this invitation to speak, I didn't realize I'd be following Governor Brown, who made, I think, one of the more historic announcements in the sort of the gospel. It was like one of the chapters in the New Testament this morning when we heard Governor Brown talk about a 40% reduction of your 1990 emissions by 2030. That's what the executive order says, and it's a remarkable and sort of historic moment. So I do run this center at Colorado State University, and this is a nice segue to both the ambassador's remarks and Governor Brown's remarks, because I'm going to talk about things that are happening around the United States at the subnational level, particularly at the state level. Not so much about the municipal level, but there are many things happening there as well, and that's a part of this conference. But I left the governor's office in Colorado in 2011, and I'm a lawyer. I had a lot of different sort of opportunities to go practice law, and instead I decided to go to Colorado State University because I had gained experience working on energy policy in my time as governor and energy and climate policy together, and looked at this and thought, you know what, the United States Congress is at a stalemate here. The action that's needed in America is really at the state level. And it was with some ambition that I and my center, my staff, the Colorado State University could play some small role in trying to move an energy agenda in America. This was 2011, and sort of realizing that Congress was going to be in this difficult place after the 2010 elections. You know, that wasn't rocket science either. It's gotten worse, though. And I don't know if you've actually read a book about the United States Congress called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks." It's true. It's written by a conservative and a progressive, one from the Brookings Institute, one from the American Enterprise Institute, and they collaborated on a book called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks." And then I, spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. I actually did a project for the president, the White House, that was making recommendations to the White House about how to move a clean energy agenda without Congress acting. We dealt with renewable energy, energy efficiency, alternative fuels for vehicles, utility business models, and then natural gas rulemaking. And I went to testify before the Committee, Environment and Public Works. The Oklahoma senator that Governor Brown referenced was at the time the ranking member. And my daughter was in back. She's 20 years old, college student. She came to D.C. with me, sat there while I testified, and afterwards she said, "That was awful." I said, "I was awful?" "Oh, no, you weren't awful." She said, "They were awful." And I said, honey, that senator from Oklahoma, I said, every time this was the second time I'd been in that committee, and both times I really got grilled. I said, every time I'm in there, I'm reminded of Clint Eastwood, who said in The Outlaw Josie Wells, "There are two kind of people in this world, and you're just not one of them, sir." And it's kind of how you feel when you're there in front of the Environment and Public Works Committee and you're getting sort of these barrage of questions about how you think and how you feel. Senator Sessions followed up with some questions and said, "What do you think about climate science?" And I wasn't being glib or anything. I said, "Listen, I actually am not a scientist." And I wasn't trying to be glib. It was really before it became vogue to say I'm not a scientist in Washington, D.C. I said, but what I understand as having been a governor and been involved in public policy is my responsibility is to manage around risks. And what I believe about the science is really about this body of scientific evidence and this vast number of scientists telling us in America, at whatever level you serve, you need to be understanding the risk and how to manage around that risk. So sort of with that in mind, in 2011, I decided to run this center at Colorado State University and to really focus on what we could do at the state level. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Colorado story. Gary referenced that in his comments, signed 57 bills, but it's a story that needs to be told as one part of a larger story around America, because while California has done such dramatic things and is such a leader, people say, well, that's only going to happen in California. Colorado is very much a fossil fuel state. big bet on a variety of different fossil fuels. And when I became governor, we looked at it and said, this is a state where we believe we need to change the direction from just sort of thinking about this as a fossil fuel state to really understanding our place in America as a state that could do far more in terms of combining energy policy with environmental policy or with climate change policy. And we viewed everything through a value lens. And this is part of our work at the center, is to try and get people who are in public policy to understand there are value lenses that you need to maintain if you're in leadership. And one of those is looking at this from an energy security perspective and ask what domestic energy is available to us if we're going to change our energy portfolio. But secondly, what are the economic development opportunities here? There's no governor who gives a State of the State message that doesn't mention jobs or growing the economy, so you can't take that idea off the table. So it's what domestic energy, what economic development opportunities, but what are the environmental challenges that we can address actually by transitioning to a clean energy portfolio. And the final one of those, and if you'll notice so far we've got energy, economic development, and environment, 3 E's. The final one of those is equity, a 4th E. So there's a little mnemonic device to thinking about this through the value lens, and that equity piece means thinking about ratepayers. Because you can build a clean energy agenda, and you can do it on the backs of people who pay electricity rates, lower income, impoverished, middle income people, and we understand that. So if you view it through that lens and say, what can you do in order to really transition to this different energy economy? And what the message that I would bring you this morning is there are places around this country where at the state level it is happening. And some may emphasize different things. Some may emphasize the economic opportunity part of it, the domestic energy part of it, the equity part of it, others the environmental part of it. But you know, we had an old saying, and when I tried cases as a prosecutor, it doesn't matter if the reason is wrong, if the outcome is right. And really, it holds true here. There are people doing different things in the 50 states around this country, and you could poll the governors. Many of them are doing them for a variety of different reasons. Some are not doing them at all. Some there is resistance. This is not all candy and flowers, but it's happening. Now, there are naysayers, and that's part of the message, too. You have to battle the naysayers. Our state, for, I think, 7 or 8 years, had bills going into House and Senate committees that would have established a 10% renewable energy standard. And we kept losing in the House and the Senate. So there are a group of people, before I became governor, that said, we're going to put it on the ballot. And we were the first state in America to pass a renewable energy standard on the ballot. It was 10% by 2015. It was a 50-cent per month charge, service charge to each of the different customers for the investor-owned utility. Well, I became governor 2 years later, and we said, you know, if the people of this state are going to pass this thing, then we should really understand that there is not only a reason to do this, or a variety of reasons to do this, but we've got some momentum here, and let's take advantage of it. So in the first 100 days after I became governor, we passed a bill that said we're going to go to 20% by 2020. We're going to put in place a 2% rate cap. We think we can get there, and we did it with the support of the investor-owned utility that had opposed the 2004 measure, because they had found in that short 2-year period that actually the subscribers, their energy customers, were in favor of doing exactly what we were now on a path to do, 20% by 2020. We had all sorts of people say, there's no way you can get to 20%. There's no way you can integrate 20% renewables into the present grid, and there is no way you can live within a 2% rate cap. 4 years later, actually 3 years later, the investor-owned utility, the CEO and I looked at each other and said, let's go to 30. And we're not going to change the rate cap because we hadn't been using it to get to 20. We were getting to 20 really early, and we were going to change the time frame. So we went to 30% by 2020 with the same rate cap in place. And that utility today is going to meet that early. That same year, we looked at a gigawatt of old coal in the metro area and said, let's take it down. And we passed legislation. I think Gary referred to this as the first piece of legislation where there's actually a mandate to remove old coal and transition it to natural gas. And we did that as well. That utility, XL Energy, it's the biggest provider in Colorado, has about 65% of all the customers. There are 5.4 million people in Colorado, so small by California standards, but still it's fairly large by other western state standards. I think we have a population larger than the populations of South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Utah put together. So it's a fairly big state, right? And we have all these customers, and we're doing this transition that involves both renewable energies, natural gas, and energy efficiency. We also had an energy efficiency resource standard. And so we had all this combined, and that utility, from its 2005 emissions to 2020, is going to reduce its emissions 35%. A 35% reduction in its utility emissions over that 15-year period because of public policy as the driver. But the interesting things that happen that prove the naysayers wrong is that we're actually going to get to that 30%. There's plenty of technology to do the kinds of integration that we need to do. There's plenty of renewable energy to actually put that much renewables onto the grid. There's actually far more if we want to go, the next step. And our energy prices, we're about 19% below the average levelized cost of energy around the country. When I became governor, we're now about 22% below. Cheap natural gas certainly helps, but so does 3-cent wind off the eastern plains. And some days, XL Energy has up to 55 or 60% of all the energy it's delivering to its customers come just from wind off the eastern plains of Colorado. So that's one story, right? The good news, right? If you combine what's happening in America, 240 million people live in a state that has a renewable portfolio standard or an energy efficiency resource standard or a climate action plan or all three. 240 million people live in a state with that. If you combine that entire population, that 240 million people, it'd be the 4th largest country in the world. So we're moving this agenda. It's not without pushback, right? We're moving it. But what we have seen in our work with states is that a variety of states around the country are really moving the agenda, and it's not like Congress where so much of it seems like there's this partisan chasm that you can't cross. We are seeing Democratic and Republican governors alike. Governors pay attention, I would say, a little more than people from D.C. because they're just closer to the ground. Every day they're in these kinds of meetings, they're talking to their constituents, they're listening to their constituents. And governors care about economic opportunity. And so much of what we've seen is sort of this mix of people hearing about sort of the issues around greenhouse gas emissions, the issues around public health kinds of issues, but also the economic opportunities that the business community, the investment world sees in clean energy and this understanding of this need to transition. And then finally, I think governors actually have to care about risk. And it goes back to sort of my thinking in my conversation with the United States Senate Committee. You really do have to understand and care about risk far more, I think, as a governor, because things can turn on you very quickly, and the risk is really on your shoulders. It's not necessarily on a congressman or a senator's shoulders. It really is on the governor. And so your neighbor to the east, California's neighbor to the east, Nevada, Governor Sandoval has done a variety of really significant things in fairly recent times. He's a card-carrying Republican. I have tremendous respect for him and for his intellectual depth. He's the incoming chair of the Western Governors Association, but he's taken down 812 megawatts of coal. He's replacing it with 496 megawatts of gas-fired generation, 215 megawatts of co-owned renewables, and 3 different 100-megawatt new renewable projects. That's Nevada, right? People look at that and say, well, it's a pretty red state. Governor's Republican, and there is an energy vision there about this transition to clean energy, and that's a good thing. Arizona is a very conservative state. And people looked at that battle that was happening last year in Arizona where they were pricing solar in front of the commission. 5 commissioners elected, all very conservative Republicans in Arizona, and there was this battle between, the public service company, Arizona Public Service Company, and the solar industry, and in the middle stood the Arizona Corporation Council having to make decisions about what the value of solar would be. And what you saw happening there was, this fight, but these folks taking their job very seriously and coming to a very reasoned place about how they finally priced solar and said, we know this is an industry that has a great deal of value. We know that it may threaten utility business models of the 20th century, but we know there's a transition that needs to happen for us to take advantage of that opportunity. And again, I don't think everything about any one of these states is like only a good news picture. There are battles within these states and battles that happen, but the outcome in Arizona, if you look at actually what happened, was a very positive outcome for solar industry, for renewable industries, renewable energy delivery, and for emissions reduction. It is going to make a tremendous difference for the state of Arizona and for the people who work every day in that state trying to understand this relationship between energy and between environmental issues or even climate change. The RGGI states in the northeast part of the state, or the northeast part of the country with the regional greenhouse gas emissions, they're also to be regarded with some deal of vision on their part for as early as they went into RGGI and sort of their understanding about how that can happen and what can be the benefits of it. There's some push and shoves. There's some give and take in the RGGI area in the northeast part of this, but the good news is that there are tremendous things being done, and if you took RGGI as a story to Paris, said, listen, this is this little area of the an area of the United States where they really do this and they get it. It's very different than what you might think if you're reading, a newspaper in some other part of the world about the United States Congress. That's the thing. People get this idea that we're not moving the needle in America because so much of the attention's focused on the inactivity and the stalemated nature of the United States Congress, and you have these pockets of things that are happening that are very important. The governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder, card-carrying Republican, also, in my mind, a very good governor and a very good guy, is looking at Michigan and saying, okay, we import 100% of our coal. It's about 60-some% of our entire inventory. We have natural gas. We have wind locally, but we also have trapped wind in Iowa, and we can actually deliver power. He might not say this. I will say this. Michigan can deliver power out of Iowa, the trapped wind in Iowa, get it across the bounds. If they get it into sort of the MISO transmission system, they can get it into Michigan, and they can get it for less than the levelized cost of coal-fired energy in Michigan without emissions, right? They can do that, and they can build their own there in Michigan. And so, after being governor for 4 years, he said, we're going to develop a clean energy plan, and we're going to get Michigan to that place where we're going to make that transition. And there's a tremendous opportunity for a state like that, and this is a guy who's a fairly serious Republican. The state of Kansas has one of the most conservative governors in America, Sam Brownback, and for the last few years, they've tried to undo the renewable energy standard in Kansas, while at the same time, there are a variety of people in that state actually profiting from the building up of wind energy, particularly on the western plains, but in some parts of central Kansas as well. And so you get this sort of battle that goes on inside the State House in Kansas that is about, undoing the renewable energy standard because it's a mandate. And you have the business community saying, not so fast. And the governor listening to the business community as opposed to sort of listening to the ideologues that are talking about whether mandates are appropriate or not in a regulated industry. So you just sort of continue to look. You see Texas with 11,000 megawatts of wind. Now, Texas, it looks like they might undo their renewable energy standard in Texas. It's an ideological battle, right? They think it's a mandate. They might undo it. They've already met it. So they're going to take out a renewable energy standard that they've actually met. But watch this. People in Texas are having a conversation about the things that they've been able to do with the wind industry, and they actually have the same capability to actually create an economic engine in Texas with the solar industry. They've got a net metering bill. I actually had the opportunity to meet with Governor Perry when he was governor of Texas. They've got the net metering bill, but they don't have good interconnection standards, and they've never tried to think about any kind of an incentive in Texas for the solar industry. But if they do a couple of things, they will transition that state like they did in wind generation. They're way ahead of any other state with respect to wind generation, but they have a fairly massive solar source as well. The state of Iowa, great wind. The state of South Dakota delivers about 20-some% of all of its power in state is wind generated. I went to Nebraska before the legislative session, had conversations with a variety of policymakers, and this past week, there's a bill. It's not a bill that we wrote. It was just sort of part of what we were trying to get people to conceptualize, was that they had so much wind. They're the fourth windiest state in America, but they only have 700 megawatts of wind built out in Nebraska, and they have a real opportunity here, both domestically but also for an export market for wind. They're moving now a bill in Nebraska to create a state production tax credit. We've seen at the federal level, the production tax credit comes and goes. It really impacts the wind industry in an awful way. It just really causes it to have this wave effect of up and down, because you don't want to be the guy that built the wind farm without the production tax credit, and you're always hoping it'll come back. So it really does cause sort of investment uncertainty when they do this in Washington, D.C. But in Nebraska, they begin to look at this and say, we have this resource, we're not tapping it. Our neighbors to the south, Kansas, our neighbors to the north, South Dakota, our neighbors to the east, Iowa, and our neighbors to sort of the southwest, Colorado, they're all building out wind in a big way. There were only 270 megawatts of wind when I became governor. We have now almost 3,000 megawatts. We got farmers making $5,000 per turbine on their land per year. If you got 10 turbines up, it's $50,000. It's nearly a farm income some years when things are difficult. And so they're looking at this saying, we're passing up this opportunity. We really have to think about this differently. In the state of Georgia, you have somebody who's a Tea Party leader who has really advanced solar energy. Now there it's about sort of getting off the grid, right? Not paying into an electrical system. And our friends in the utility markets are looking at that and can be very worried about it. But it is still a group of people saying we need to inspire the use of solar in places that are very conservative. The state of New York, where we're doing some work, if you look at their work on reforming the utility business model, it's actually another very good news story. You might expect it, come out of New York, but this conversation is happening around the country, and it's actually happening among utilities. And I know there are a lot of folks from the utility world here today, and I've been impressed in my conversations with the utilities about their own sense about this transition and what role they can play in it. I feel like our investor-owned utility, XL, is a very enlightened utility, and our conversations are really positive about how that transition has to happen inside the utility world, inside the utility business model, in order for us to get to sort of this different place where we can really say we have this clean energy economy. And then finally, and you're going to have presentations on this, the Clean Power Plan. It is an EPA plan, but it looks to all 50 states. And it says to each of those 50 states, you need an implementation plan that will get your emissions reduction to this place so that we as a nation can get 30% emissions reduction from our 2005 numbers. And so we're working with states. We're actually really happy to have this work with 13 states, North Dakota, South Dakota, and every state west of that, including California, Oregon, and Washington. We know there's a lot of work on the Clean Power Plan being done in states. Regionally, I'm not sure if anybody else is in the business of being able to convene the 13 states in the West and to really think about Western issues, to think about them state by state, but also what are those issues that we can look at and say they're unique to the West, they're unique to parts of the West, and the ways that we might work together in building implementation going forward as a Western region. And so we've had the governor's energy and environmental folks from that region come. We've had 100% attendance for all of our convenings since last July. Patrick Cummins is moderating one of the panels. He's our lead. Your former Western Climate Initiative Executive Director is now the lead for this project for mine at CSU. And again, it's interesting as a governor to just watch this. There can be sort of one level of conversation at the governor's level where there are great political there are concerns, but some of those concerns are undergirded by sort of political thinking, political thought. And you get the governor's folks in a room to try and talk constructively about how we move forward, and I'm impressed. I'm just really impressed by the people who are part of these conversations, who are thinking in a real way about how we make this transition state by state, but how we do it as a country. And it makes me feel very good that when Paris comes around in December, while there will still be this fight in the United States Senate, the United States Congress, there are people sort of working at this at what we call the subnational level, working for governors and mayors, working for environmental quality departments, that people in government, people in the utility world, or the private sector, people even in the industrial sectors, as the ambassador referred to, who are saying, we need to get to this place. And we need to get there with some sense of urgency about it. How do we do it? And I've been impressed by the people that we've been able to work with at the state level who understand the necessity of doing that, who are willing to sort of check their politics at the door and say, what role can we play in getting there? That's the good news. So thank you for the opportunity to have been able to make remarks here, and thank you for all of your great work. God bless you.